Welcome to the Sisters in Crime Writers Podcast. Everyone has a unique writing journey, so join us for conversations about those journeys from the writers themselves. I'm Julie Henriques. I'm the Executive Director of Sisters in Crime, and I am thrilled to welcome Laurie R. King to the podcast today.
Hi, Julie.
Hello. Laurie is the New York Times bestselling author of 18 Mary Russell-Sherlock Holmes novels, 5 Kate Martinellis, 2 Stuyvesant-Greys, she's going to correct me on that, 5 standalones, novellas, and anthologies, and in 22 is launching a new series with Back to the Garden, featuring San Francisco Police Department Inspector Raquel Laing. She's won the Edgar, Agatha, Anthony, Lambda, Wolfe, Macavity, Creasey, Dagger, and Romantic Times Career Achievement Awards, and has an honorary doctorate, is a Baker Street Irregular, and a member of SinC, MWA, CWA, TWI, and IAHW. In 22, she was named MWA's Grand Master. Laurie, welcome to the podcast, and thank you so much for being here.
I'm so pleased to be here. Thank you, Julie.
Well, I love talking about writing to writers, especially writers as accomplished as you are, and we have so much to talk about with your books, but let's start where I always start in this podcast and talk about your journey as a writer. When did you say to yourself, I want to write books?
I love the idea of being accomplished as a writer because mostly what that means is you've survived. So, I started writing in 1987, which just seems like another world, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I was first published in 92, but for the first 93. But I started writing in 1987, and I think it was kind of like that business that so many people get started writing because they go to the library, bring some books home, and none of them catch their imagination. So they think, man, I could do better than this, couldn't I? So in a sort of huff, you sit down and start writing, and pretty soon you got a book. And that's sort of how I started. And I think that one of the things that no writer in my position really likes to admit, except those of us who do, is how much luck plays a part in this whole thing. It happened to be the right time for what I was writing. I happened to catch the eye of the fabulous Ruth Cavan at St. Martin's Press. I happened to be able to write at the pace that they needed. And I happened to have 3 books out. 3 books finished more or less by the time my first one came out, so that it meant I could say to them, well, yes, I have another book available for next year, which, if I'd had to just turn one out then and there, might not have been possible because I was a mom. I had young kids, and who has time to work a full-time job on top of that? But it's the advantage of not selling your first book until you've got 2 more written.
Yeah. And were they 2 more in the same series, or were they 2 separate books?
One in the same series, so that I wrote 2 in the Mary Russell series. And while my agent was shopping them around, I got an agent after that. And while she was shopping them around, I thought, well, the world doesn't seem really jumping on the idea of Mary Russell as a young apprentice to Sherlock Holmes. So maybe I'll write something a little closer to home, a little more realistic, a little harder edge. And so I wrote the first of the Kate Martinellis, called A Grave Talent. And as, again, luck would have it, that was the first one sold, which was fortunate because it won the Edgar Award for Best First Novel for 1993 novels, and 1994 was when they gave the prize. And I don't think that the Russells would have done that. MWA tends to look at things that are just slightly edgier than the really cozy, and also it's difficult to justify giving a prize to something that is basically using someone else's character, which I certainly do in the Russell and Holmes stories. So one thing and another. As it turns out, the Russell and Holmes are way more popular than the Martinellis, but the Martinellis were the ones to have won a couple of major awards and been nominated for several others. So it's nice to be known for both. But I wrote the first of the Russell stories, A Beekeeper's Apprentice. And then I wrote what turned out to be the third one. Letter of Mary was the third. And then I wrote A Grave Talent after, while I was waiting to see if the world wanted to read more about Mary Russell.
And so I want to back up a little bit more. 35 years ago, you said, I'm going to try to do this because I'm bringing books home. Had you been a writer before, a creative writer, or was this a new endeavor for you, or how did you come to build your writing muscle?
Well, in the same way that journalists learn how to write by just having to turn out words, I was a grad student for the last few years. And one thing that grad students have to do is to turn out words. You turn in papers, you write a thesis, you're producing words that make it cease to be intimidating. I mean, you put words on the page and then you make them better, but they're not, the blank page is not quite so fearful a thing. So when I finished my master's degree, which was in Old Testament theology, with a natural next step was to move into writing fiction, particularly crime fiction. I had two small kids. I had a husband who taught the school year. He was a professor at the university, which meant that I couldn't really see getting a normal job of a 50-week-a-year job, because quite often we would just take off in the summer. And there's not a lot of jobs other than in school that you can say to your employers, by the way, I'm going to be off in England or India or wherever for the next 8 weeks. So when the kids were small, I sat down and I started writing, thinking that sentences on a page were something that I could do. I had the skill. And although I'd never taken a creative writing course, I had several years before experimented with fiction. I started a sort of sci-fi futuristic novel and got halfway through it and realized I had no clue how to write the rest of it. So I put it aside when the kids were small. And so I'd sort of experimented, but not a very successful experiment. But I thought, I've been reading stories my whole life. The language of fiction is ingrained in my brain and in my bones. So surely I can tell a story of some kind. So that's where it started. And I sat down and I wrote what turned out to be almost precisely the first sentence of The Beekeeper's Apprentice. And with that simple sentence of, I was 15 when I first met Sherlock Holmes. Mary Russell and her voice and her situation just stepped into my life. It's extremely fortunate when a writer has that experience, and it's rare. Mostly we have to think about our characters. We have to experiment with what they look like and where they come from and what their backstory might be, and where this particular tale is going to take them. But with this With The Beekeeper's Apprentice, I was extremely fortunate in that Russell just stepped in and took over. So.
Was it always crime fiction for you? I mean, you know, obviously these are the first books you wrote, but had, you know, was that what you were drawn to, or what brought you to crime fiction?
If you had told me before I started writing that I was going to be writing novels in 2 years or 5 years, I would have assumed that what I would be writing would be sci-fi, because I tended to read mostly science fiction at the time. I'd read Dorothy Sayers and I'd read the classics, and I kept up with the sort of spread of what mysteries were. So I had at least read mysteries, mostly the golden era, classical kind of whodunits. But when I started writing, I think my brain requires more of a structure than sci-fi. Sci-fi and mainstream fiction can go anywhere. They can just go anywhere. You can do anything, and there aren't any real rules other than some sort of inner consistency in the books. But mysteries, and especially the traditional mystery, has a skeleton that you hang the story on, doesn't it? I mean, the final appearance of the flesh that clothes the skeleton, as it were, can look like anything. I mean, it can be tall to short, any color, any shape, any flavor and personality, but it has to be built around the skeleton of the story. And at the time, since I knew mostly the sort of traditional detective whodunit structure, that's where I started. I think that my stuff probably would be more in the center of things, both then and now. That is, if you look at the genre as being a spectrum from the very, very cozy, the Agatha Christie whodunit puzzle mystery, and at the other end, the driving thriller. The middle ground is generally called suspense, and that's the ground that I'm usually found in and classified in and feel comfortable in. I find that both ends of the spectrum are more limited to me. I want more excitement in my cozies and less heart pound in my thrillers. So I'm suspense in the middle.
I love that definition, because that's a new to me, but accurate, because thrillers and suspense and how we define things and genres are a flowing conversation that we can all talk about at conferences, and we do things, but you have to understand where your novels fit and what what you want to write, and also what the market will do with it. Is part of it.
Yeah, and I think that as beginning writers, it's one of the questions that I know that when I got started, I wrote A Grave Talent not thinking about it being a mystery. I mean, I don't think that anyone who really starts is aware of the idea of mystery as a genre, because they're all fiction. I think a lot of us, when we start, are pretty well unaware of the quote rules unquote of the genre and why we should follow them and why we shouldn't. I last year co-edited a book called How to Write a Mystery, and one of the first people we chose was Neil Nyren, the editor, to write the introduction chapter to say basically, what is this genre? Why are there rules? Why do we follow them? And when do we break them? Because it's sort of like abstract art, which is all very well and good, but it's much better if the artist can do realistic sketching and chooses not to.
Right.
So that's sort of where I think a lot of us start, is not really thinking of the novel that we are writing as being a crime novel, a mystery novel, but it's a novel. Well,
Mm-hmm.
the novel was about a murder in a community and the two cops that solve it. And you think, where else would you put it? But on the mystery shelf. But at the time, I thought of it as a novel.
Yeah.
Fortunately, my agent knew the market a little better than I, and sent it to somebody who was actually interested in mystery novels rather than in general novels.
Can we talk about Mary Russell a little bit? And, I love that line came to you. And, I have a friend who can't start a book until she knows the first line. And this character came to you, and Sherlock Holmes, who is so iconic and who everybody knows, but you've been able to develop him and different facets of him that stay true, but also enrich from what Sir Arthur Conan Doyle did all those years ago. Were you? I mean, you're writing your first novel, so maybe thinking about this less. But working with a character like Sherlock Holmes is not for the faint of heart, because there are a lot of people with very strong opinions about him and his everything else. And in the years since, we've got so many more adaptations of him, and what's I think of Sherlock as opposed to Jeremy Brett's, which I think is the best Sherlock Holmes. But can you talk to me about that? Just sort of taking this character and giving him a different life.
I think, again, I was fortunate in my ignorance, because it didn't really occur to me that there would be this entire community of Sherlock Holmes fans, in the sense of fanatic.
Yes, yes, yes.
That might notice me, and that might object to what I was doing with the character. So, being 1987, I think it was probable that some of the Jeremy Bretts were playing on the television. What they would have been broadcasting at the time, I don't know. But I was not a particular Sherlock Holmes fan or reader before I started writing the Russell character. And I write the first sentence, and then I think, oh dear, maybe I should know something about Sherlock Holmes before I write much more. so I went out to my local bookshop and got 2 volumes of the collected stories that were, I think, done by Dover Books. And they were mass market, so they were extremely tiny print. I still have them somewhere. And I probably couldn't even read them now because they're such tiny print. But I read my way through the stories, and I think it's an interesting way of discovering a classical character like Holmes. Because I'd read, what is it that you read in high school? The Speckled Band and the Hound of the Baskervilles kind of thing. So,
yeah.
And it's impossible not to know the Holmes character to some extent. But I had not read the stories in any sort of methodical way, and I probably had not read most of them until I sat down and read my way just straight through the collected works. And I found that he was not the character that I had anticipated. You tend to think of him as being this thinking machine, and just someone who intimidates anyone, and who has no particular emotional content to him. But what I found in the books was a man who is just consumed by the need to fight evil. A man who is capable of deep friendships, although not of expressing it. I mean, that's very English anyway, and very Victorian, but Holmes even more so. And there's humor in the stories, which I had really not anticipated. There's various things that make me laugh aloud because they're just so absurd. And working my way through them, I began to see my way to a character who I could live with in the background. And of course, the first stories, maybe even half a dozen novels of the Russells. Mary Russell is a young female feminist 20th century Sherlock Holmes. Mm-hmm. So if you took his brain and you transplanted it into this young woman's body, that's what it would look like. So the two of them are well matched. In the first few scenes, she gets the better of him, which is a deeply satisfying thing to write, of a young woman who gets the better of Sherlock Holmes. And the bulk of those first stories have him very much in the background. He is a supporting actor. And I had to make sure that the publishers always put on the cover that this was a Russell and Holmes novel, not a Holmes and Russell novel. Mm-hmm. It was one that they redid the cover after I saw it and corrected that, and I was not happy, and they had to reissue the cover because it said a Holmes and Russell novel, and I said absolutely not. He is a supporting actor, and she is the main character. But as I got maybe 6 or 7 books in, I began to become more interested in him as a character, and to look at this character that Conan Doyle stopped writing at the eve of the Great War, that Conan Doyle could never envision him in the days after the war started. He wrote stories that were written after that, but they were all set before. And I thought, this is really selling the character short. I think that someone with as much imagination and energy and drive and commitment as the character Sherlock Holmes would not be relegated into the background and just fade away. So I felt free to let him develop as a character. And that's been really interesting to watch him. And I think the first time you really see that is the book that's set in San Francisco called Locked Rooms, where Russell is remembering and re-experiencing her own past. And she's proving to be this massively competent woman. She's proving to be an unreliable narrator. And it isn't until Holmes pops up in the book and gives his take on something that's just happened that you begin to notice that she is unreliable, that she is emotionally compromised, and that he is a person worthy of listening to. So anyway, starting with that book and then going on, there's chapters that I let him have in his voice. I keep him to third person, and the other parts are all written first person Russell. But it's been interesting to develop him as a character.
And it's so interesting because when you started these books, the internet, people don't, the internet wasn't a thing.
It wasn't.
There were the listservs and discussion boards and things weren't a thing. And so when all of that became more of an influence, you were well into the series and a conversationalist in that. But
I think that when I first was published, the first 2 or 3 listservs were just starting, and there was one called, I think it was called The Hounds of the Internet, where the Sherlock Holmes community hung out. Well, I lived in a rural area. We had the kind of internet connection that involved a telephone and putting the receiver down on a little box, and it would warble. So if you got a warble and it actually connected, you could have an internet connection for a few minutes until it dropped off. So that was the extent of my, cutting edge technology for me was the fax machine. That was really exciting when we could get a fax machine. But so I was completely unaware that when the first couple of Russells came out, I was flamed online. But because I wasn't online, I had no clue. I had no idea that there were groups that met. I mean, I knew that there was a group called the Baker Street Irregulars, but they might have all been on Mars for all I knew. And you know, I didn't know that there was this huge argument going on in the background for years. And I think that by the time I became aware of it, enough of the Sherlockians had been reassured that no, this king woman is not going to start writing, Holmesian erotica or something.
Yeah, we can trust her.
But she not only respects the character of Sherlock Holmes, but also respects the author Conan Doyle. And by the time I got out there at all, the voices were mixed enough that there were friends in the Sherlockian community who invited me in and welcomed me, and eventually made me, as you mentioned in your intro, made me a member of the Baker Street Irregulars, which is a very limited and honored position. So there we are.
You have been incredibly prolific in your writing journey and continue to be. And I want to talk about the new novel. I also want to talk about the anthology about how to write a mystery. But can you just let us in a little bit about your process for writing? How do you write a book?
Well, I think like many human beings on the planet at the moment, not just writers, but human beings, you kind of have before and now, right? So that, yes. Before COVID, I would, I've always tended to alternate series to some extent. The Russells have proved more popular for various reasons. But I can't bear writing the same characters year in and year out. For some people, it's perfectly comfortable. I mean, Sue Grafton was absolutely happy to have, no one but her, Kinsey Milhone. Lee Child, everything he wants to do in mysteries can be done with Jack Reacher. And that's great for them, but I can't. It makes me crazy. I had one sometimes I have to do a couple of Russells in a row and then another one. But one time I had to do 4 in a row. And the fourth book starts with poor Russell with a severe head injury and amnesia. And I thought, if I have to do a 5th one, she's going to lose a limb. I hurt my characters the longer I've lived with them. So I said to my editor, look, unless you want something really awful to happen to these people, maybe we should do something else next time. So I tend to alternate the worlds, either a series and a series and a standalone. I have generally tended to write a book a year so that I'll be doing kind of vague research beforehand before I start writing. But I tend not to start a book seriously until I've finished the last one. And when I say finished, I mean finished the rewrite. I can do page proofs, which take less attention than an actual edit. But to think about the plot, the characters, and the world, 2 different sets of that at the same time, I find really tough. But I can kind of work myself up to starting a book beforehand. So I'm doing a lot of the research. I'm accumulating the books. I'm traveling. Most of the Russells tend to move around because I decided early on that unless I wanted to get into the Cabot Cove problem of having these 2 people who live in rural Sussex and who keep finding dead bodies, I needed to shift them around the world. And there was a convenient way of doing that in that Mycroft Holmes, Holmes's brother, is sort of in charge of this international spy wing of the government. So he just sends them places, which is very convenient for me because it's an excuse.
Yeah.
It's an excuse to travel to Israel and Japan and all these places. So I will usually do any travel beforehand. Once or twice I've done it during or even after I've done this sort of basic draft, but usually it's beforehand to give me an idea of the time and place. And then I have, let's see, I don't outline. I am an organic writer. I tend to know the characters, the place, the time, and the essential issues in the book and the sort of flavor of the book. When I first started, I tended to know the final scene, just so I would have an idea of who was still standing when the dust settled, and I would write towards that.
Mm-hmm.
When I was about 6 or 7 books in, I suddenly realized that I didn't know the final scene in the book I was working on, and I found that absolutely terrifying until I just pushed forward. And that seems to be how the brain works. For those of us who are not outliners, I think that, to my experience, the brain knows where it's going, that there is an outline for that book in the back of the head. It's just that some of us don't have the ability to put it on paper as a separate thing from the actual writing. When I write a book, I'm writing the outline. It's a 250, 300 page outline. That is not the novel. I mean, my first drafts are not only bad, but they are extremely short. But it tells me what the novel will look like.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll write that in about 3 or 4 months. That's working, 1,500 to 2,000 words a day. I will finish that, send it off to my editor, usually at that point. I don't send stuff unless I have some specific question that I need feedback on. I don't tend to send my editor things unfinished. There've just been a couple of times when I've been uncertain about. There was one book that I thought, should this be in the third person or the first? Because it didn't feel right, and I talked to them, and that was helpful. But for the most part, they know what I'm doing, and I go away and do it, and then I give them the first draft. Writing this letter that always starts, "This is crap, but." Read this with one eye closed. And it's I'm fortunate in that I've only had 3 primary editors during my career.
Wow.
So I don't have to keep breaking people in and telling them, I know this is awful. It's roughly where the book is going. And I'm sure there are some editors out there who would get my first draft and they'd turn the book down and they'd let me keep my events because it was just so awful. Fortunately, the editors that I've worked with have been able to see where the story is behind the rubbish. The book goes more or less cold while they are reading it. And that usually is fairly rapidly. Sometimes it takes them a month to get back to me, but sometimes it's faster because it's not a line edit. It's a basic edit. So it's a developmental edit. And while I am waiting for that, I'm doing peripheral things so that if there's, I keep a whole list of notes as to things I don't know and need to in the book. So I'll be researching, the place or forensics or all kinds of things. So whatever I've made notes on as I've been writing that haven't been worth stopping what I was doing to do the research then and there, but needs to be done before the book is actually publishable. So it means that when I get my editorial letter back, the manuscript has gone cold in my head, and I can then pick it up and look at it with fresh eyes. It's almost impossible to edit your own stuff at the best of times. But if you try and do it while it's freshly written, it's really, really difficult. But if it's had 3 or 4 weeks to sit while you've been doing other stuff, you can see it's easy to see the flaws, but sometimes you can see the places where you were going and where you could do it correctly in the final draft. So then launch off on the final draft, and that takes probably the same amount of time, three months or so, to do the final draft. Partly it depends on how long the first draft has taken. So I find if I have a 4-month first draft, by my second draft is 3 months, and vice versa. And then we get into the nitty gritty of the editorial and the line edits, and eventually goes off to the copy editor, and then I can turn to the next book. So all of that process takes roughly a year for me.
And you write some current, present day, you write some historical, and historical takes that extra layer of research and accuracy and everything else.
Especially if it's a history that is new to me. By this time I know the 20s fairly well because of the 18 books in the Russell and Holmes series. But there was one that I had to research, the Victorian era, because quite a bit of it took place when Sherlock Holmes is young. And that was a challenge, to dive into a completely different era and the clothes they wore, and when did they stop wearing bustles and go into crinolines and vice versa. all the rest of that you have to get right, because otherwise you get those letters from people saying,
yeah,
in 1863.
Exactly.
So
historical readers are notorious for accuracy.
Yeah. And it was sort of the opposite problem with the current book, Back to the Garden, because it's set in a time that I don't think of as historical. It's the 70s. And so I know, I was an adult then, right? And so I had to keep looking things up, because I had to think about, well, when did that come in, and what music were we actually listening to? And 1979, were women in the wide shoulder pads yet and disco, or were we still hippies then? So,
and why 1979 for this new book?
Well, I always wanted to write one in the 60s, because the 60s is such a fun time, and I thought it's my era. I live in a town in California it never really got out of the 60s. It's Santa Cruz is a very much a hippie community still. But the problem with the 60s is that those of us who remember it are getting a little old around the edges. So if you're going to write a cold case book that is partly modern time and partly then, you can't kill off all your suspects in the cold case murder. They can't all be in their 90s or in care facilities. So I kind of had to move things on about 10 years, so that, I think it's reasonable to have people in their 60s and 70s as being active and vital. I mean, I've got a brother-in-law in his 80s who runs regularly and lifts weights and all the rest of it. So I know that there are those of us who are still active, but if you make them in the 90s, you sort of think you really limit your suspect pool rather drastically.
Yes.
So I kind of shifted it on, and in fact, it proved to be a good decision, because the late 70s were a time when the communes that had been launched in the 60s and early 70s, with all this enthusiasm and the back to the earth and the flower power and the alternative lifestyles and how we were going to change the world, those are coming to an end. I mean, it's kind of like the book that I wrote that set just before the stock market crash in the 20s, that the reader knows that things are coming to an end, but the characters don't. And in 1979, you can feel the 60s are over. They are way over, even in the communes. And harder drugs are moving in and different issues are coming along. And people have children. The kids have been born in the communes, but do you really want your kid to be educated to not have proper dental care, to not have the backing? I mean, you have to be really committed to the commune life to take it on to your kids. Mm-hmm. And I think so many of the communes that were running with great enthusiasm through the early part of the 70s began to fall apart in the late 70s. And that, as it turns out, is when this book is set. You have set in the later days of a commune, and the why and the changes that are coming in.
And is the premise of the book going to be cold cases from different periods? Or?
I think so. I think that working cold cases is interesting, and the main character, when in this book, Raquel Laing is a San Francisco Police Department inspector who has been seconded to the cold case unit because of a series of injuries and a sort of legal question as well. So she comes under the wing of a man who is with cold case, and who those who have read the Kate Martinellis series know, because Al Hawken is in those as well. So this is not a Martinelli book, but Al Hawken is in them. So there's this sort of overlap.
Yeah.
So Raquel Laing becomes the sort of protege of this very brilliant inspector. But she doesn't really fit well in the police department milieu. And it's because she is, and this is something I only realized after I'd written my first draft and looked at this character, that I'd had real problems with figuring out what her backstory was and how much I could give away, what sort of details should I talk about her, and decided that I would finish the first draft and then go back and decide how much to fill in. That I realized, looking at that first draft, that her personality is very much like that of Sherlock Holmes. And one of the key issues of Sherlock Holmes is that you don't know anything about him. Mm-hmm. That's one of the fascinating things about the character, is he basically has no family. He's a brother, but doesn't appear except in 2 stories. He has a friendship, but it's mostly with Watson. He went to university, but you don't know if he graduated or what university it was.
Right.
So
right.
I kind of took that as the pattern for Raquel Laing of, there's lots of stuff you don't know about with her. Mm-hmm. And I think that sets the groundwork for an interesting series, of some of which will be exploring her clearly enigmatic backstory, mm-hmm. and some of which may not. And I think that the idea of the cold case investigations is an interesting one, because you can do a couple of timelines and play with, just like I play with in the Russells, I do different, I have them move around the world, and that gives mm-hmm. me a whole new set of issues and characters that they go to. And this gives me a different set of issues and possibilities and places in the area. I mean, obviously, cold case tends to work mostly its own area. In this one, the San Francisco Police Department actually has no right to investigate where she investigates, but it's explained in the book, so I get away with it.
Well, what I'm also hearing you say, sorry to interrupt, but what I'm also hearing you say, which I find fascinating and inspiring, is that you're also challenging yourself. You're like, I'm going to write 2 timelines. I'm going to create this character who's challenging, and at this stage of your career to set that challenge for yourself is very inspiring.
It was an interesting experience writing this book, because you basically have two stories. But unless you're going to have them completely separated and tell the story of Rob Gardner comes home from Vietnam, and then he's the link that takes you all the way to the end, unless you're going to tell that whole story and end it in 1979 and then start the new story nowadays and go on, you have to find a way of weaving them together.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a fascinating writing challenge to have two completely different sets of characters. I mean, there's only a handful of characters who are in both timelines. And yet to make them all instantly recognizable, that you're not lost when you shift the chapters. And to give the backstory chapters and the current chapters in ways that feed into each other and illuminate each other. Now, there's a couple of chapters where, you have to trust your reader. I think that there are 2 or 3 places in the book where you have these then chapters, the backstory chapters, where there are things that Raquel Laing doesn't know and needs to, but she couldn't find them out in this specific way. But the reader needs to know them. So the reader finds things out that Raquel Laing doesn't know yet. And without having someone actually tell her this by an interview, because it's something that, there's one scene where there's 2 characters, one of whom she hasn't interviewed yet, and one of whom isn't available to her. And yet the reader needs to see this, because it puts some things together for the reader that are good to know then, rather than to sort of tack it on at the end.
Right.
So it's the craft of weaving these things together was indeed an interesting challenge. As if we didn't need any more interesting challenges over the last, 18 months in our lives.
Another project you did take on is the How to Write a Mystery, which the Mystery Writers of America published, and you edited with Lee Child. And I love that this book is out there for people to read and to peruse as they're navigating their own writing journey. But, I'm sure you've come across good and bad writing advice, probably gotten both. Were there any things that stood out to you as you were editing and compiling or having conversations with people about that book that you thought, oh, people really need to understand this?
I think the basic premise of the book, and one that we encouraged our contributors to lean into, and one that goes along with both MWA and Sisters in Crime, is that this is a community of writers, and we all can learn from each other, and we all do things differently. So that, it's sort of the perfect exemplar of How to Write a Mystery is made up of contributions from 70 different writers. Some of them are very small contributions from a sort of contest that we ran. And some of them were, about half of them are people that we specifically asked to write a chapter on this or that. Mm-hmm. Meg Gardner writing the one on thrillers. Various people. So, but each of those, we asked them to write that this is how they work and how it works for them, not in general terms of, well, you don't have to work this way, but this is how I work. Because the balance of it is the voices of people, and this is how it works for them. And a great illustration of the two chapters that we chose to put next to each other, where Jeff Deaver writes the chapter on "You Must Outline," because he is Mr. Outline. If you've ever heard him speak, he gives a series of talks.
Yeah.
When he was president of MWA, he gave a talk. He flew in at his own expense to give workshop on outlining to each of the 11 MWA chapters. I mean, he's great on the outline. So he was the obvious person to try to write the chapter on outline. And then you have Lee Child, who doesn't outline, who doesn't even take much editorial contribution without fighting. And his chapter was never outline. So you have Jeff Deaver always outline, Lee Child never outline. Both hugely successful authors, both brilliant writers, and both of them. And we put those two chapters right next to each other because, and I think we all need to realize this at the beginning of our career, is that what works for you may not work for me. We just had a very good weekend in Corte Madera, the Book Passage Writing Conference, where that was a thing that I think any craft conference is great to get across, because you have certain people whose faces just light up when you talk about how you work as a person who doesn't outline. I mean, I don't feel that I have to outline. Occasionally it's a useful tool, and occasionally I will list out the things that I need to do. But my brain doesn't work that way. And there's no reason that your brain has to work that way either if you outline better. So
I love that. And I also love what you talked about with community, because writing is a solo activity, but the crime writing community, any writing community is important, but the crime writing community is a very good community, I think.
It's remarkably and paradoxically supportive, isn't it? I mean,
yes.
Considering that we spend our lives murdering people and hiding the facts, when we get together, we're all really friendly and great and supportive. And both Sisters in Crime and MWA have forums that if you're having a problem, you can log on to and say, anyone know what to do about X, or can you help me with Y? I think we're all looking forward to the relaunch of get-togethers, actual face-to-face get-togethers, because the amount that you learn hanging out in a bar with a friend is extraordinary. And that's kind of what any of the get-togethers are like.
Yeah, and commiserating in person.
Now there's that.
We all fake it in social media, but when you see somebody, it's like, all right, let's have a real conversation.
It's hard to complain about your publicist or your cover in print. Over a drink, you can start a bitch fest that just never ends.
Laurie, what do you wish you'd known sooner as a writer or on this publishing, as an author? I mean, they're two separate journeys, but
I think there was something that I kind of stumbled into, and sort of wish I'd thought about it sooner, and instead of just realizing it later on. And that is that there's a difference between writing a book and starting a career. And I think a lot of us especially people who do self-pub, end up getting so wrapped up in the book they've written that they don't look at what they're writing. They don't look at the fact that if you want to be a writer, if you want to be a long-term career-based writer, you have to keep putting words on the page, and not just when you finish, you keep polishing and then you find somebody to fix it and then you choose to self-pub and you promote it and all the rest. Meanwhile, a year has gone by, 2 years have gone by, and you're not producing new material. You're not stretching yourself or discovering yourself as a writer. So I think that And especially, as I said, it's especially dangerous for self-pub authors, because the temptation is to just keep dancing around the one that you finished and not go on to the next one. The balance between writing and promoting is always tough. And, when I got started, I remember being told by my publisher that they didn't want me involved in promotion. They wanted me to show up at events, and that was all. And of course, that was obviously before the days of the internet, but they didn't want me to do stuff other than show up. They didn't want my input. Now it's the absolute opposite, that if you are expecting your publisher to do it all for you, you're going to be sadly mistaken. Any new writer, any established writer has to keep working on the next one before they get wrapped up in what they've already done.
Such great advice, and you did that at the beginning, and I didn't comment on it then, but that you were ready with 3 books when you got an agent or people were interested, that you'd kept writing instead of fixing that first book over and over and over again, is something that most people don't do. They keep working on that first book over and over and over again, whereas your second book's better than your first because you learned how to write the first time.
I think that probably was one of the advantages of being in the 80s and early 90s, that you were forced to delay, because there was no point in, if you sent a manuscript off to a publisher whose name you got out from the back of, right, Publisher's World or whatever, there was no point in working on it while they were looking at it, because then they wouldn't be seeing the same manuscript. So if you were going to work on anything, you had to start something else, because actually putting something in the mail and sending it off meant that you're not going to see it for weeks, months. And of course, in the days of, those were the days of the slush pile, which is basically a closet in the publishers where they pile the manuscripts. And then on a Friday afternoon, all the assistant editors would get together with pizza and beer and look through the manuscripts and see if they had anything that they wanted to publish. Well, basically, if you weren't in the first 10% of the heaped up manuscripts, you would just get your manuscript back. But I was sort of forced into doing it because nobody had bought the first one instantaneously. So if I wanted to keep working, I would have to start something new. So,
yeah. Well, obviously the writing thing has worked out well for you.
It has. I have a roof over my head. I can't complain.
No, and congratulations on Back to the Garden and launching a new series.
Oh, it'll be fun. I think it'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah, and we will see you at conferences coming up.
Gotcha, come on, all the rest of them, and
That is a good thing. Thank you so much. Thank you for being a member of Sisters in Crime. Thank you so much for a great conversation.
Thank you, Julie. This has been lovely. And here's to crime to all of you.
Thank you for being with us today. Sisters in Crime is about community. We were founded to advocate for women crime writers, and we continue that mission by fighting for equity in the crime writing community. Sisters in Crime is an international, inclusive organization for all who write and love crime fiction, mystery, thrillers, and suspense. Join us at sistersincrime.org and make sure you subscribe to this podcast.